I'm here because something is profoundly wrong with the way we live in America. Profoundly wrong. It's structurally wrong in a host of interconnected ways. Today, after 30 years of attacks on the basic idea that government should have anything to do with the private marketplace, 30 years of attacks on the idea that government intervention is even appropriate, we're in a horrible situation, and all of you know that. I'm going to talk today about Internet access. That's been our theme, and this is the theme of the conference. And it's an important symptom of this horrible situation, but I want you to keep this very large picture in mind. Because of our current unquestioning belief in the primacy of individual profit-taking as the only value that matters, we are living now, right now, through a period of grotesque inequality in America. It is overwhelming to consider the vicious outgrowth of inequality. Bad health, missed educational opportunity, increasingly everything coming from depression and stress. Alcoholism, obesity, gambling, criminality, rage, fear, lack of trust, a feeling of corrosive unfairness. I'm worried about the violence and the turn towards authoritarianism that is ahead. Democracy and capitalism just can't survive if its workings are reduced to just giving the wealthy another chance to become wealthier. Because inequality is not a technical issue. Inequality causes and exacerbates a steep loss in social cohesion. Higher wealth people begin to feel as if they're living in a series of gated communities whose main purpose is to keep out less fortunate people. And less fortunate people deeply internalize this feeling of hopelessness and despair. This loss of a sense of community, of brotherhood, triggers extreme uncertainty. That in a barbaric circle triggers fear, lack of trust in civic institutions at the same time that those civic institutions are systematically undermined, underfunded, and hollowed out. Our failure to make sure that respectable Internet access service, fiber to every home and business in America, at a reasonable price is available to everyone, it's not even available to rich people in America, is just one part of a terrifying landscape. We are suffering deeply from an eviscerated public sector and an increasing lack of trust, not just in the last year, over the last 30 years. And all of this is connected. We don't quite see how bad it is. We're like an ant on a tablecloth. We're like the people right before 1914. Our parents and grandparents understood how important it is for governments to moderate the chaos and despair that results from the ravages of unrestrained money-making and profit-taking. We've forgotten so much. After the two world wars and the Great Depression that followed 1914, Americans and the citizens of every other developed country absolutely understood that it simply is not true that unrestrained private gain always leads to public good. You would have been laughed off a stage in the early 1950s if you'd said that, and we had a Republican president in power at the time. Today, even mentioning the words economic policy, industrial policy, oversight, or regulation triggers the word socialist, and I can't tell you how ridiculous that is. I'm not talking about government telling us what is good for us. I'm talking about the private sector being required through oversight and industrial policy to provide world-class baseline infrastructure, fiber, reaching homes and businesses throughout the country. The public sector has the responsibility to require the private sector to do this. Alone among developed countries, we've always relied on private companies to provide us with telecommunications. And now the public sector has to step up. This is just like Eisenhower in 1952, requiring highway infrastructure to stretch across the land. This is about ensuring that everyone, every American, rich and poor, has access to services and resources that are essential to a thriving, decent life. One of those things that is necessary today, and you all know this, is basic, I'm going to up the ante, basic but world-class, persistent, uncapped Internet access for everyone at a reasonable rate, somewhere between $25 and $4 a month, with subsidies for the very lowest income Americans. Fixing this situation by having the courage to have a public sector industrial policy strategy when it comes to telecommunications infrastructure, this isn't by itself going to fix America. I know that. We've got tons of other problems. People need affordable housing, adequate public transit, decent baseline public education, a way to be protected from the ravages of climate change. I get it, we need all of that, but getting internet access right may not be sufficient, but it is necessary. It's necessary, it's central. Information is central to absolutely everything we do and every policy we care about as a nation. Reducing communications inequality and upgrading the entire country is justified not only from a social justice perspective, but from a cost-benefit perspective as well. We are writing enormous invisible checks every day, running enormous digital deficits as a country because we have failed on this central issue. And again, we are ceasing to be a we. We're driving ever larger wedges between rural and urban Americans and between white and non-white Americans with our communications failures. That's the greatest ultimate risk of all. We should be shocked. Today in America, the land where the Internet protocol was invented, in America, the land of grit, innovation, new ideas, and thriving life, we should be looking the rest of the world in the rearview mirror when it comes to high-capacity, cheap Internet access. But we're not. Rich people in cities are paying through the nose for second-rate service which is not fiber. Poor people and people in rural areas are struggling to pay for third-rate services where it is available at all. And as Mark Farrell, the mayor of San Francisco, said in the video, we're dumbing down generations of new Americans. It's just like leaded water in Flint. Life for many people has once again become solitary, poor, and more than a little nasty. Although it is so fundamental to a thriving life to have choices, respect, and agency, without high-speed Internet access, your choices are few and desperately local. We have taken away opportunities from millions of Americans. As you know, this is not about connectivity in the abstract or as a technical matter. The only point of connectivity is what you can do with it. It's about freedom to choose your own activities, always on, no data caps. And it's not just about inclusion, but also the ability to participate and thrive. The well-being of millions, of really 330 million Americans and all of their businesses, is being harmed. If you remember one thing from this talk, I hope it's this. This appalling state of affairs didn't happen naturally. It happened because of failures of policy that can be fixed. Right now, the policy of the nation is to allow the giant carriers to back up their trucks to the loading docks of the FCC and take as much money as they can drive away with, while extracting unbelievable rents from every part of society, not just the very poor, but also the rich and also the business sector. It's an extractive industry. As a country, we are capable of making different choices. Here's the reason for all this. There are some essential things that we used to understand that the private sector, an unfettered free market left to its own devices, is never going to provide to all Americans, even though everyone needs them. High-capacity, ubiquitous, cheap Internet access is one of them. Listen, a sensible, profit-making company in the communications infrastructure business, which has very high fixed initial costs to build those networks, will make the most profit where it can. By charging rich people enormous amounts, avoid competition wherever it can by consolidating and dividing markets. You take Cleveland, I'll take Minneapolis, and leave everyone that doesn't fit its business model or can't afford its charges out. And never, ever upgrading their crappy existing services to fiber. That's a root story in America, and particularly in the Cleveland story. Fiber to the node even isn't enough. Everyone that doesn't fit the business model includes a lot of people. Most people with yearly incomes under $25,000 a year don't have high-speed Internet access at home. That's what's happened in America. There is nothing evil or malign about these companies. There are 5 of them. They dominate Internet access in America: Comcast, Spectrum, AT&T, Verizon, and CenturyLink. But their unrestrained incentives are not aligned with what Americans need. Electricity, by the way, has exactly these same characteristics. And 100 years ago, it took Franklin Roosevelt fighting private electrical company trusts to ensure that everyone everywhere got cheap power. People may have forgotten the story, but in cities in America, people in poorer neighborhoods did not get electricity as quickly as the richer. in some cases outright government operation, as in the Tennessee Valley Authority. We are today replicating all the patterns we went through with electricity when it comes to internet access. And we'll need a presidential candidate in 2020 who understands this issue and can take leadership, a digital FDR. It is amazing, but electricity was the primary domestic policy issue in the election of 1932 because it was such a searing problem for the country. In a democracy, there's a difference between private incentives, which are to optimize profits, nothing wrong with that, and public value, and the public values of fairness, universality, and justice. And our public sector needs to be bolstered and able to stand up for itself so that the private sector can do its job well and everyone can thrive. Otherwise, why choose America? You know, in China, there is no line between the public and private, right? The searing unfairness of digital services in both urban and rural areas of this country is happening in a broad context. We're suffering from a digital divide as a country. On the global stage, there's a deep and widening divide between the US on the one hand and Japan, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, and China on the other, where fiber optic lines now reach or soon will reach all residents, and where new ways of making a living, new businesses, new ways of ensuring the thriving lives of citizens are likely to emerge first. We are also, as you know, suffering from gaping digital divides between richer and poorer Americans that will make our existing already shocking inequality worse and even further weaken the fabric of democracy. So here are the facts which underline the wonderful video that Mariah has made. Local cable and telco monopolies dominate access. They have no particular incentives to improve their services or charge what people can actually afford for them. They are unconstrained, untroubled, unruffled by either competition or oversight most of the time. And for services providing the capacity that the FCC now labels high-speed internet access, 25 megabits down, megabits down, 3 up, something like 90% of Americans have at most one choice of provider who can set whatever prices they want. Why the FCC privileges downloads or uploads is confounding to me. This is part of participating, not just being entertained. About a quarter of Americans, or almost 74 million people, live in areas where less than 40% of residents subscribe to even awful copper line access. People in rural areas are 10 times less likely to have access to modern-day high-capacity connections than those in urban areas. Rural areas are even less likely to have choices of providers. And where access is present, low adoption is tightly correlated with low socioeconomic status. About 60% of people making $20,000 or less a year don't have wired access, even awful last-century copper wired access at home. But 80% of people making between $50,000 and $75,000 a year do. Price makes a big difference, as the video made clear. We don't compare well internationally either. When it comes to the highest speed packages here in America, we pay more than just a handful of developed countries: Mexico, Chile, Brazil, Turkey. And in these other places, South Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Sweden, I keep going there to try to find out what they did to make the situation so different. They have many more choices of carriers, far lower prices, far higher capacity. In South Korea, Japan, Singapore, and Hong Kong, residents can subscribe to gigabit capacity, 10 times more capacity than 100 megabit subscription, for between $30 and $50 a month. In Sweden, which has announced plans to have 98% of its residents connected to gigabit fiber by 2025, the 100 megabit symmetrical fiber connections already available to 70% of residents cost between $35 and $40 a month to access. Singapore's connectivity story is just astonishing. You can buy gigabit access from any one of many providers for $40 a month. Even in New York, you can't buy that access, and you can buy something that's a tenth as good for more money, $105 a month for 100 megabit per second access from Verizon. Yes, these places are smaller. Yes, they're more homogeneous than the US, but somehow we manage the telephone, somehow we manage electricity, and it is embarrassing to have a Korean tell me that coming to America is like taking a rural vacation because life is so slow here. It is embarrassing for the Stockholm mayor. The mayor of Stockholm said to me, "What can I do to help America?" You know, this is America. We're supposed to be exceptional. Well, I'm here to remind us that we are not in this instance. We keep repeating patterns. In the 1930s, government surveyors looked at neighborhoods in America and outlined some in red that they felt were hazardous for mortgage credit risks because of residents' racial and ethnic demographics. Basically, anybody who wasn't Northern European white was considered to be a problem for the value of the area. Bill Callahan makes this clear in the video. These continue to be areas of stubborn poverty, these redlined areas, where loans were very expensive to obtain or simply unavailable. Low-income minorities couldn't buy homes, and persistent, searing racial wealth gaps have been maintained in this country. As you know well, those same redline areas remain places where these perfectly rational, not mean, not malign, private companies are not going. It's not that they physically can't, it's that they don't have to, and their shareholders aren't interested. By contrast, when a new immigrant area opens in Stockholm, they run train lines and fiber out there immediately. That's the first step. We're not Sweden. We're never going to be Sweden. But the sensible nature of the Stockholm plan is where I want to end this brief talk. Swedes don't want the government to sell private internet access. They love the private sector. What they did 20 years ago, is put just passive infrastructure like a street grid, neutral conduit, or glass for fiber optic, wholesale services. Then that's leased at set prices to private sector competitors. Presto, a competitive market for world-class internet access. And that's where San Francisco is heading right now because of Mayor Farrell. Because it turns out that capitalism needs government structures to thrive. That's the regulatory ideal. Government intervention, particularly when it comes to basic infrastructure, like a functioning communication system or a street grid, facilitates genuinely free markets and a thriving populace by ensuring that basic inputs are in place that are fair and public-minded. But without government involvement, you'll never get to that place. The reason we're doing so badly in the United States is that in 2004, we deregulated the entire internet service marketplace. We swerved away from government oversight of internet access providers. We assumed that competition would protect consumers and somehow magically ensure access for all. That hasn't happened. It was actually predictable that that wouldn't happen. We just seem to need to learn the same lesson over and over again. In order to change anything large, you need two things. You need both crisis and leadership. We certainly have a crisis. Now it's time to see whether leadership emerges, and I'm most hopeful of people in Mariah's generation to be leaders, but it has to happen faster so that girl can finish high school with a great internet access connection. We need leadership to emerge that will take strong economic policy action to get that basic fiber infrastructure installed to homes and businesses across the country. I'm not saying fixing this situation is sufficient to stave off our further collapse. I am saying fixing it is necessary. It's like electricity. It's essential for the fabric of our democracy to hold. Thank you very much.